Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property.
Well, good morning, or is it good afternoon?
Even good evening.
Oh, good evening even. All will become clear. So welcome to another Conveyancing Matters show. Today we have a very special guest. It's Michael Joyce. So I suppose, Michael, if you introduce not just yourself, but where you're from, and all become clear.
Well, thank you very much, Stu, and good morning to yourself and Lorraine.
Hi.
It is indeed a very pleasant evening here in Australia, as you will already probably have guessed from the twang in my voice. But I am a legal practitioner in Australia, and I look forward to talking with you today.
Oh, it's really kind of you to join us, Michael. And we said before we came on air, you've got a lovely sort of screensaver shot of you in the bush in Oz, and we're just sort of sitting here in the cold, really. But it's really kind of you to join us. And the reason that we particularly wanted to talk to your lovely self, Michael, is that, as you may be aware, we had coming out of the pandemic, sort of in the last 18 months or so, the Chancellor, to revitalise the property market as he saw fit, gave us a stamp duty land tax, and well, as it transpired, no holiday for conveyancers, and the market went completely mad, and all of the pressure points that we knew existed in the England and Wales conveyancing system became really, really, starkly highlighted. And lots of people have come to the fore saying sort of how terrible the conveyancing system in England and Wales is. So Stu and I hit on an idea that it would be really great to talk to people in other jurisdictions about how conveyancing, the process of the transfer of title to land happens in other jurisdictions. And so here you are in lovely Oz, Michael. So perhaps as a starting point then, you'd give us a sort of brief sort of outline of the process, and we'll pick some of those parts about sort of from really how, if somebody decides over there they want to put their house on the market, Michael, how's a buyer found, and in a nutshell, what does the property lawyer do?
Sure. Now, I can preface by saying that not only in the UK, but in Australia as well, the market has just gone bonkers since the pandemic began. We didn't have any stimulus to do that. It seemed to be contrary to expectations, but we're experiencing the same phenomenon here. But look, the process is, if you want to put your house on the market, is that you generally would approach a lawyer, a conveyancer, who is a separate body of professionals who do conveyancing, and a real estate agent. And either the lawyer or the conveyancer will prepare the contract, and the agent will do the marketing of that property once they have that contract available. So step number one is to have a contract prepared, and then the hordes of interested buyers can come and look through the house.
So that's really interesting to start with, Michael. So the contract, so what is that, the contract to actually sell the house to the buyer?
That's correct, Lorraine. Under statute law here, you cannot market a residential property in New South Wales. I should also say that there are different rules applying in the different states to Australia, but we'll get to that shortly. But in New South Wales, you have to have a contract available for any marketing of a residential property to take place.
Oh, that's interesting. And that can be done by the agent or the lawyer?
The lawyer or the alternative professionals in the area called conveyancers are able to prepare the contract. The agents aren't qualified to do so, but once they have that contract, they can then open the doors to the hordes of buyers.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry to be dim there, Michael, but what function does the contract play at that stage?
Contract plays a very important function because it then makes it known to the purchaser all of the matters that are contained in the contract. And the contract consists not only of the usual sorts of contractual terms that you would expect, but it also contains a number of annexures that are statutorily obliged to be annexed to a contract. Things such as a copy of the title from the land registry, a plan of the land, any encumbrances such as easements or covenants that impact on the land, planning information as to what can be built and what can't be built on the land. All of that is contained in the contract so that a prospective purchaser at least enters the building with the opportunity of having their eyes wide open as to what they might be buying.
Oh, okay.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because over here there's quite a play for upfront information, as everybody calls it. So I suppose your system's pretty similar to maybe an auction at the moment here. Just provide as much upfront as possible. So would you have, for example, searches over there that might be collated within this pack?
Yes, there are a number of things that have to be attached to the contract. We call it our vendor disclosure legislation, where the vendor must disclose a whole range of matters that might impact on the title of that property. So that if you're attending an auction or if you're simply endeavouring to buy by private treaty, well, then all of those things that you would otherwise rely on your lawyer to investigate at some later stage are all there in the contract and available and known to the purchaser, when they walk into the house that they're interested in buying.
So would a prospective buyer, Michael, sort of also instruct a conveyancer sort of at the point at which they're going to look at the place? Where would the buyer's conveyance? A vendor can get a lawyer, a legal practitioner, or a conveyancer to do the work. A purchaser will take it upon themselves as when they choose to decide to engage either a legal practitioner or a conveyancer. Most commonly, though, most people will simply go out and have a sniff around at properties they might be interested in, and then, of course, they'll find the house of their dreams and want to proceed straight away. So it's not until after they start looking around for prospective properties that they would generally approach a legal practitioner or conveyancer. Oh, okay. I mean, that's sort of similar to over here in terms of the buyer's position, really. So,
Yes.
When the buyer instructs their lawyer or conveyancer, then, Michael, how does the process go from there? And we're always very interested. We get very hung up over here, Stu, don't we, about timeframes? Give Michael a bit of a shock. Tell him average timeframes at the moment.
We had a guest on last week, and they were saying that an average length of time between finding a property and completion was 26 weeks.
Yeah.
So go on, hit us with how long an average time frame would be in your neck of the woods.
Maximum of 8 weeks.
Oh,
maximum as well.
Maximum of 8 weeks, and often it's done in a shorter period of time than that. So that if you go out, if you're a buyer, you go out and you find a property of your dreams, you get your legal practitioner involved. You would generally have a formal contract in place between the two parties within a fortnight, and the settlement period under a formal contract is most commonly 6 weeks. Settlement will take place within 6 weeks, but sometimes that period of time is shortened because the parties agree to it being shortened.
And what happens? So the essentially contractual obligations. So what we would know here, Michael, as exchange is that couple of weeks, and then what we would call completion. So the date the balance of the purchase money is handed over in exchange for the keys, essentially, is 6 weeks. So what are the parties over there doing in that 6 week period then, Michael?
We use the same terms of exchange and completion, or settlement sometimes. In that period of time, they're basically finalising their finance, if they're relying on finance, and they're also doing some other inquiries of various, generally statutory bodies, as to whether there's any proposals that impact the property, such as road widening or possible resumption of the land for some other sort of statutory purpose. So there's a few little checks and balances, but there's not a great deal that has to be done between the parties.
What happens, Michael, then, for example, if that initial sort of gump of information, you spoke about rights of way and covenants. What happens if, for example, there was something negative in there? At what point would that be addressed?
Well, it's addressed at the time before the contract is entered into, because if there's an adverse easement or an adverse covenant on the title of the property, well, it's in the contract. And so a buyer will know that before they even get to the stage of exchanging contracts. They'll make their mind up as to whether to proceed or not based on what's in the contract and the advice their lawyer gives them. So yeah, it's known up front.
Does the lawyer / conveyancer in Oz Michael, or in your part of Oz, have an obligation to the lender who might be involved? Because, for example, I mean, what Stu's getting at there is we have, as you well know, I'm sure, you know, properties that are vast numbers of properties that are affected a lot by covenants, by an obligation to do or not to do something. Yes. And clearly there are often over here, you know, lots of technical breaches, whether it's something, you know, the property's been extended in breach of an old covenant, that sort of thing. And we would tend these days to address those with indemnity insurance, with a sort of one-off indemnity insurance policy, fairly cheap sort of thing in the grand scheme of things. But what we certainly would have is, because you're sort of saying, well, if there's a problem with the title, the buyer it's a bit of a Hobson's choice. The buyer either buys it with the problem or they don't proceed at all. Whereas right. I think we have more of a sort of a midway through, really, Michael, here, in the sense that often we can't put the problem right, but we often will use indemnity insurance to at least soften the blow in case something goes wrong. So it's not quite such a clear-cut choice, because nobody would move over here, really. There'd be, you know, hundreds of thousands of transactions that didn't proceed if we didn't have that indemnity insurance sort of solution. But what's the layer of additional responsibility over here is in relation to the lenders who are lending money for the, you know, we act for them as well if we act for the buyer, and we might take a view that a covenant's old and, you know, frankly, the risk of enforcement is so low as to not be worrying about. But we still these days feel the need to get a policy because that's what the lenders want.
Okay, you've raised a lot of really interesting issues. We don't have indemnity insurance here. It's been mooted from time to time over the last few decades, but it's never really taken off. So obviously, if it's not client driven, if it's not market driven, it's not going to take a foothold, and it's never really taken off. We don't have the position here where generally lawyers will act for a purchaser and a financier in the same transaction. That's pretty much banned, not banned legally, but ethically it's not considered appropriate because of the various conflicts of interest of both parties. So to address the issue that I think you're raising, Lorraine, is that it is very common for a purchaser to be required to send the contract to the solicitor for the financier, or the financier if they don't have legal representation, because they'll often do the work in-house. And then it's up to the financier to decide whether they're going to continue to proceed to finance that transaction. But generally, if you get to the stage of exchanging contracts, financiers don't pull out after that. They've done all of their preliminary inquiries as to what they need to know about the property before they make the decision as to whether to finance it or not.
So the decision to lend and the financing will essentially be agreed in principle prior to exchange, Michael.
Exactly, and a purchaser would be folly to proceed without that in place.
Because that conflict point is one of your real bugbears too, isn't it? The lender.
I mean, the way we are here, we traditionally always acted on behalf of the bank and the client, and of course, we may have to tell the bank something which is a negative to the client, and it just creates that conflict in my mind continually. So I just can't see here how we can move forward with dual representation, but that's probably another story for another day. So it's really interesting to hear sort of what you're saying, because I think if we were to all sort of take a step back, what you're talking about is almost what we would like to happen here, maybe, Lorraine, wouldn't it? I mean, it sounds it sounds perfect. No indemnity.
Well, the decision's made before the purchaser proceeds to commit themselves to the contract as to whether they're going to get the money or not. So the process of actually lining the money up after contracts are exchanged is very, very rarely have any difficulty attached to it. It's a pretty mechanical process.
Yeah, as I say, that's just fascinating because we get sort of terribly bogged down in the money, and actually one of the things we mentioned in our sort of email chats, Michael, and you may have answered this question really, but again, the lawyer, the conveyancer, whether solicitor or, as in Stu's case, licensed conveyancer, the anti-money laundering responsibilities that we as lawyers have over here are quite extraordinary in terms of sort of checking source of buyers' funds, source of wealth, etc., etc. So how is that whole part of the process, which has become a huge front-loaded part of the process over here. How is that handled in Oz?
Fortunately, we don't have to do detailed AML checks prior to a purchase or proceeding, but the government has sort of substituted a different regime where it is now the buyer's solicitor's obligation to carry out a verification of the identity of the buyer in a very detailed manner. And those identity details during the course of the transaction are conveyed to the various government authorities that are involved in the transaction, such as the Land Registry and the Taxation Authority. So that the government ends up with not only the purchase solicitor's verification of the identity of the buyer, but also sufficient detail to be able to identify that buyer. We don't have to identify the source or verify the above board nature of the source of the funds, but we pretty much have to do everything else in relation to the buyer.
Well, that's really interesting. So the responsibilities seem sort of, just different to here, because we do ID, but we essentially, if we act on a seller, the buyer's entitled to rely on that ID, but essentially, but we don't have to give that authentication to anybody or to any bodies, other than we have to confirm to the Land Registry that we've done the checks, but that's only in case of fraud. That's just where the indemnity lies, really, Michael. But
Right.
but sort of why isn't that? Do you have any idea why there aren't any
no
sort of
idea.
no
No
AML
idea
checks? That's really
No idea.
interesting.
Other than maybe that fraud has never reared its ugly head with the source of funds. I mean, obviously there's a lot of money washed through Australia like any developed country these days, but it's never been part of the conveyancing process for us to check the source of funds. There's one exception to that, and that is where a buyer supplies in excess, I think the amount is $10,000 in cash. We have to report that to the respective authority, but other than that, we don't have to question the source of funds.
So on an average transaction, Michael, how much cash will a buyer produce?
None. Cash is not used in the transaction generally, especially now with everything being done by electronic funds transfer. And also most of the transactions are engaged in with the buyer who's being financed, if not all of or a majority of the proceeds of the cost of the property, the finance will be coming from the bank, and so the source of the funds is not an issue. We don't have a lot where the buyers are cashed up and supply the funds by electronic funds transfer, but we're under no obligation to disclose anything other than the ordinary ID checks that I mentioned earlier.
Gosh, that's really interesting, isn't it?
Really interesting. Yeah, really, really interesting. So out of interest, Michael, do clients or are clients able to obtain 100% finance to buy properties?
They can, but there needs to be sufficient equity in their existing land holdings to be able to secure the loan with additional land holdings. So your first home buyer, for example, wouldn't be able to borrow 100%, but if you own more than one property, you could mortgage the second property to secure the 100% of borrowings for another property.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's interesting. So we have very little sort of, actual, cash changing hands these days between lawyers, and that, that's certainly been clamped down on. I mean, Stu and I have talked on earlier Conveyancing Matters chats, Michael, of where we both recall, clients rolling in with bags of cash and really us not thinking twice about it, didn't we, Stu?
Suitcases full of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd be turning them around 3 times and pushing them straight back out.
I mean, all we used to think sort of 30 years ago was, well, let's just get them round to the bank before the teller pulls the thing down at lunchtime so they can count it and not us. But I suppose when I didn't phrase that very well when I was talking about cash, because we don't, 500 quid most is, probably what most firms will accept in actual hard physical cash. But I suppose what I was getting at, Michael, is even the proportion of the funds coming from the client's own resources, the bank we still have to essentially check where that money is now, and if we're doing our job properly, where they got that money from. And you
We're
say,
under no obligation to do that.
God, that's really, really interesting. That's really, really interesting.
Incredible. So just changing sort of tangent slightly, Michael, what would be the relationship between the lawyers and, say, the estate agent in Australia? How would it work in terms of receiving work and maybe their role?
Look, it's an at length relationship, of course. It's an arm's length relationship. But obviously in localities, real estate agents develop good working relationships with the practitioners that operate in that locality. So there's a lot of repeat business generally gets pushed from the real estate agents towards particular practitioners in those localities because they've had a good history of working with each other. The real estate agents are looking for a lawyer that doesn't create too much of a hindrance to the sale going through, because the real estate agent wants to see the deal done. And sometimes they might shy away from those lawyers who are particularly pedantic about the way they pursue a matter for their purchaser clients. But the real estate agent is generally at arm's length with the practitioners in the area, yeah. And of course, any client can choose whoever they want to act for them. There's no formal requirement for one real estate agent to force a client to pick a particular legal practitioner.
So what would you say, Michael, are if there are any sort of problems in with the system where you are, what would you perceive them to be? What would you say they are?
Well, I think I've just sort of morphed into it. The biggest problem that I see is that the real estate agents are engaged by the vendor to do a job for the vendor. And then you've got the vendor who also engages a legal practitioner to do the conveyancing, and a purchaser who comes along and engages a legal practitioner to do the conveyancing. And quite often, the real estate agents are at odds with the lawyers, who tend not to be as in a hurry as the real estate agents are. We've come up with a statutory solution to that conflict between the urgency of the agents to get the deal inked and the lawyers to make sure that everything's carefully considered before the contracts are signed and exchanged, remembering that that's the point of no return once the exchange has taken place. And that solution has been to provide buyers with what we call a cooling off period. That is a period of generally between 5 and 10 days after exchange has taken place, whereby the purchaser can rescind the contract and forfeit a small monetary penalty if they choose to do so. So what that cooling off period allows buyers to do is to sign a contract without having obtained legal advice on that contract prior to signing it. The agent will attend to exchanging contracts, which may not be permissible in the UK, I don't know, but here agents can exchange contracts. And then a buyer has that comfort of the 5 to 10 day cooling off period to race off to their lawyer, get the advice about the contract and the transaction, and choose within that 5 to 10 days as to whether they want to proceed or whether they want to rescind the contract. And in that case, they will forfeit a small monetary penalty for that.
God, that's really interesting, because Stu, that sort of feels like a bit of a halfway house between our reservation agreement and our standard conditions of sale, doesn't it?
Exactly that. It's funny, isn't it? Everything that various bodies are putting forward in terms of change to the conveyancing system, your system seems to encompass it. It's really weird having this chat, because so many things that we would like to introduce over here that some of us think may happen, some not, unless it's mandated. You guys seem to be doing already. And obviously the proof's in the pudding if it's only taken 8 weeks.
Well, it's working pretty well, although it's very frustrating sometimes when acting for a purchaser that the agent's pushing the client into signing the contract, and you as their advisor, the purchaser solicitor, is saying, look, calm down, slow down, it'll all happen in due course. But the purchasers are in terrible fear, and the agents milk the fact that there might be another buyer out there lurking around that can come in and snatch or gazump the property from them. And that's a fear that the agents use regularly, in my view. Many agents will not agree with that, but in my view, that they use that fear that buyer might lose the property to get them to sign the contract very quickly. They're of course bound, but of course they've got that cooling off period that they can rely on after that.
Sounds really interesting, because certainly that sort of agent pushing the process has really become a very sort of polarizing situation over here. And as I just alluded to, Michael, we've got our sort of standard contract that the lawyers will deal with, and the seller's solicitor will prepare, or conveyancer will prepare a contract pack, but that will sort of go out once the buyer has been found, essentially. The idea, as Stu alluded to, is to try to move that information forward a bit. Personally, I'm not convinced it will make that much difference in many ways. And Stu, your firm's been doing it for years and nobody seems to want it. And I don't mean that with any disrespect at all, but tell Michael what you've said about upfront packs before.
I mean, years and years and years ago, we had something here called HIPS, which was basically a home information pack, provided upfront information to a buyer so that when they were bidding on the property, they could view all this information, very similar to how maybe an auction works. But we carried that process on, no rocket science whatsoever, just trying to secure clients as early as possible by having them complete various forms at the onset of the transaction. And we try to roll that out with many estate agents that we deal with, but the actual sort of take up on that was really limited. And I think Lorraine and I sort of share the opinion here that I'm not sure how much change there will be unless it becomes compulsory. Voluntary introducing reservation agreements or upfront information, I'm not so sure the appetite is as strong in the UK as people would maybe make it out to be, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, we tend to drag our heels a bit with change, don't we? We don't like change. It's scared of the consequences. We've had a new system introduced in Australia recently called PEXA.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, PEXA is an interesting introduction because it was a very major change to the conveyancing system, and it involves the completion and the time leading up to completion. It's in the past, and I'm not sure what the system is in the UK, but the past in Australia, a settlement would take place in person. The buyer solicitor would meet with the seller solicitor, and seller solicitor would hand over the title deed, and the buyer solicitor would hand over bank checks, and that was all done face to face. But PEXA has converted that to all occurring online. Almost all settlements now in New South Wales and increasingly across Australia are happening in an online environment where the title to the property is transferred electronically and registered electronically at the land registry. And the funds are transferred electronically from the incoming financier through the purchaser to the vendor, and if necessary, any existing mortgage that's on the title is paid out at that time as well. Process takes about 30 minutes from go to woe, and it's all finished. So gone are the days where you meet and you have a physical settlement. You just click the button on your computer, and once everything's in place, it all happens electronically, and at the end of it, the purchase is registered on title, any mortgage registered on title, and so on and so forth.
Now, that was the holy grail of the Land Registration Act 2002 over here, Michael. How long's PEXA been with you guys?
I think it was made. The mandatory issue was the one that triggered my thinking about it, because it wasn't until it was made mandatory that it really took off.
So when was it introduced, give or take? Do you remember?
About 2016, I think it was introduced initially, but it wasn't made mandatory till about 2017, 2018.
Yeah, you see, as I say, that's been the holy grail, because what the Land Registry over here, as I say, wanted to set up and set up the platform for, or the legal framework for, in the Land Registration Act as long ago as 2002, was electronic conveyancing, and that holy grail really of being able to, well, their initial vision was to actually, do everything online, do the title check, do everything online, the contract online, and then the completion exactly as you envisage. So that the money is paid on completion. Our stamp duty land tax would have to go to the revenue. and then the title is updated automatically from the detail in the transfer. That I think is still the vision, but it's important to have ambition, but I always felt it was over ambitious, because of course what we have to do here, and the banks need to be on side, and frankly I think there's just too many individual vested interests, because of course and I don't know how that happens with you guys, but most sellers will have a mortgage that has to be redeemed to enable them to move, and of course what I think was always going to be the challenge was making sure that the mortgages were redeemed, but basically all of the money ended up in the right place. So the purchase money came in, the proportion of that needed to go to redeem the seller's mortgage went off to the right place. The land registry got its fees, the revenue got its taxes, and I actually still think it's that bit, it's the money bit, and getting all the money in the right place. I think is still the sort of technological challenge.
Our system achieves all of that, and it was very tentatively approached initially, but it's working quite well. I mean, the vast majority, like a high 90% of transactions, are now settled that way. For standard
that's interesting. How much of your title is registered, though, Michael? At the land
how much of the title? I'm not quite sure.
How much of your land mass, if you like?
Oh, in the country.
Yeah.
Oh, well, gee, you raise a really interesting issue there, because we have a form of title here called native title, which covers large swathes of the country. How much is registered under our Torrens title system? I don't know. Obviously, most of the urban and regional areas are registered under our Torrens title system. So, almost all of the land transactions that are undertaken for consideration fall within that system of Torrens title.
So, and that would be analogous to our land registry, Michael, would it? Because essentially it's a government department, really, and not a government agency that's responsible for essentially maintaining the computerised land register of title.
Indeed, it is. Although it's been privatised in New South Wales, which might surprise you. But
you know what? They keep trying to do that over here, and and there's always a big fuss, because the state guarantee of title, that sort of underlying state guarantee, is really seen as a real important foundation on which our system stands. The government moot it periodically. It's the only sort of petition I'm ever prepared to get behind, that the land registry remains in public hands.
Well, it's very important that the ownership of land be honoured by any government in which that land operates, because the participants in the system need to have the faith that their land is not going to be whisked away from them, like we see happens in some other less fortunate countries throughout the world from time to time. But it seems to be working with a private system of land registration pretty well. And they've also got some pretty onerous statutory obligations to comply with as well. So
that's really, really interesting. I mean, the reason I asked about sort of proportion of land that might be registered and therefore can use your PEXA system or not is because we still have this, I can't remember, that it's a very high, probably high 80% of the land mass in England and Wales that is registered with the land registry, but we still have our unregistered system, as we call it over here, where a seller has to prove ownership of land essentially by production of documents, the traditional system.
Yes. We call that old systems title transactions, but we still have a very small minority transactions that follow that process.
But that's the transaction. If you've got a big chain of transactions, Michael, and you've got one unregistered transaction in the middle of it,
yes,
that's the one that will sort of knacker up your completion using the PEXA system, of course.
Well, yes. Well, those transactions don't get to the PEXA system because it only applies to the Torrens title system of land. So any of those old deeds-based systems of title in Australia are slowly but eventually being converted to the title system of registration.
So you'd have to have a situation over there then if you've got an unregistered transaction. Would the party involved there, they'd perhaps have to complete on their two transactions sort of separately?
Well, there's so few pieces of land now, Lorraine, in New South Wales, where it is subject to that old system deeds-based title chain of ownership. There's very few practitioners who know how to do it. I've done maybe a half a dozen to a dozen in my 30 years of practice. And I just haven't come across one now for 5 or 10 years. It's so few plots of land,
okay.
so few plots that are subject to it. Most of them are being converted to Torrens title.
Because over here, Stu, it's fair to say that unregistered's becoming a dying art, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, where we're situated, we have a few areas that have a high percentage of unregistered still, such as Benfleet and Canvey Island. So I think in Essex, we still have a fair bit of it, but there's still plenty of practitioners out there that don't come across it in certain areas, but it's geographically relevant, I think, Lorraine, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I practice, Michael, in East Anglia, sort of Norfolk and Suffolk, and you know,
Yes.
There's still a fair bit. Usually the good old farmers, Michael, that you know, don't want to spend any money, don't want to transfer any land to anybody.
Yeah.
And I used to get calls from Suffolk farmers, because the land reg used to have a sort of thing where they would write to people, they would identify unregistered tracts of land, and they would try to persuade, you know, the landowners to make voluntary applications to register. And I get these calls from my Suffolk farmers, and then they'd say, got this letter from the land registry. I say, oh, have you, John? That's good. Well, they talk about registering my land. I said, oh, okay. Is it going to cost me money? I said, well, yes, John, it is. They'd say, have I got to do it? And I say, no, John, you haven't. He said, all right. And literally, you could hear the letter hitting the bin. You could hear him ripping it. No, you haven't got to do it, mate. It's fine. Yeah, bless them. But I always knew as well, actually, getting off subject, you always know with a Suffolk farmer, Michael, if you've done a good job, because they're fantastically understated. And if they're really, really, really pleased with something you've done, they'll just go, super job. And that's it. That's the extent of Suffolk and Norfolk happy. But what's interesting me about this conversation, Michael, is broadly speaking, how much of the process you've described is government mandated?
Well, there's an overlying statutory framework which governs many aspects of the transaction. From obviously the documents that have to be disclosed in the contract initially, to the process that you follow in settling in the PEXA system. How much mandated? Oh, look, most of it is mandated one way or the other. It's a very consistent process, although every property is different, as you know, as a property lawyer, but the process is very consistent from one transaction to another and from one locality to another. So that's why lawyers don't play a big role in that anymore. The licensed conveyancers, because they tend to operate a little cheaper than lawyers, have a very large, fairly automated and fairly straightforward most of the time.
Okay, thank you. Well, Michael, thanks so much for joining us. That was really, really enlightening, really, really fascinating, wasn't it, Stu?
Really enjoyable, and I think it's food for thought for everyone. I think most people would agree that you know, your system over there does sound a lot better than ours at the moment.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you, Lorraine. It's been a delight.
Thanks for joining us.
Take care.